My name is Jack Cole, and I'm retired from the New Jersey State Police, where I spent 26 years. 14 of those years I worked in narcotics, basically undercover. I spent a lot of time at first working on young people on the streets who were smoking pot and dipping and dabbing in drugs. And then later, as the problem grew worse and worse and worse, I actually was working billion-dollar international heroin and cocaine rings. And I was certainly there long enough to see the horrors that we have created in the United States with our policy of a war on drugs. Everything is perhaps about 1,000 times worse than it was in 1970 when our president, or the man running for president, Richard Milhouse Nixon, declared war on drugs. It was his idea, and it had absolutely nothing to do with drugs. It had mainly to do with the fact that he was running for the presidency for the second time, and he thought this time it would really be nice if he could win. So he knew if he was a strong anti-crime guy, it'd bring him a lot of votes. But boy, if he could be in charge of a war, how those votes would pour in. And it did work, after all. He was elected. And in his first year in office, he managed to get the U.S. Congress to pass massive funding bills to give money to any police department willing to hire officers to fight his war on drugs. Give you an idea how huge these things were. When I joined the New Jersey State Police in 1964, we had 1,700 troopers, and we had a 7-man narcotic unit. Just 7. Always seemed perfectly adequate for the job we needed to do then. And 6 years later, we had exactly those same numbers until October of 1970, when, thanks to these funding bills of Mr. Nixon's, we went from a 7-man narcotic unit to a 76-person bureau overnight in one step, all paid for by the federal government. Now, you know, when you increase the size of a police organization that only has one job, arrest drug offenders, you increase that by 11 times its size, you set up a great deal of expectation in the coming years. The next year we were expected to arrest 11 times more drug offenders than we did the year before. And this was replicated across the entire United States. So we were off and running. We were literally in a race to justify this money that was spent. And we were arresting almost anybody in sight and charging them as drug dealers.
It sounds to me like you are somewhat critical of this policy. Just to be absolutely sure, back in those days, you were a dedicated police officer. You were dedicated to this, fighting this war. Absolutely.
I'm still a dedicated person. I'm retired now, but I'm certainly dedicated to the role of policing. It's not the police who are at fault here. It is the politicians who created prohibition of drugs.
It appears that you have somehow changed your viewpoint on this problem.
Oh, certainly.
What happened? What made you change your mind?
Well, after 3 years of living undercover in the streets with these people who were drug users, I discovered that they weren't the people that I had been taught they were. We had been taught that they were almost demonic. When I went out there, I thought they might have horns growing out of their heads, you know. These were supposedly the worst people on earth. And after 3 years of living out there with them, I discovered that they're no different than I am. They have the same wants, the same needs. They want respect. They want a decent job. They want food for their family and everything else. The only thing that separates them from me is they want to put something in their body that I don't want to put in my body. And look at the stuff I put in my body. I drink straight bourbon whiskey, you know, one of the worst drugs known to human beings. But that's a legal drug, so I'm okay.
But what happened to make you, was there any particular event or any incident that made you realize that maybe...
Certainly was. Certainly. What made me realize that this problem was not the problem that the police say it is, but it was the problem of prohibition itself, was actually working on it and seeing that no matter what we did, things got worse. Every year it got worse than it was the year before. And each successive year we threw more money at it, hired more police officers, made harsher laws, mandatory minimum sentences, 3 strikes you're outlaw, put these people in jail for life. Nothing worked. When I was a young trooper in 1970, at the start of the war, we considered an ounce, 28 grams of cocaine or maybe 7 grams of heroin, a large seizure. That was a large drug seizure. What do we get today? We get individual seizures of 10 tons of heroin, 20 tons of cocaine, one seizure each. And nothing changes on the street, except drugs keep getting cheaper, more potent, and far easier for our children to access. Now that's a failed policy, any way you look at it. So when I retired, I felt so bad about my part in implementing what today I consider not only a failed war on drugs, but far worse than that, it is a self-perpetuating and constantly expanding policy disaster. So I sat down with 4 other police officers, and we created this organization, LEAP, which stands for Law Enforcement Against Prohibition. Today, we have 20,000 members. We're not just cops anymore. We're police, we're judges, we're prosecutors, we're prison wardens. We even have DEA and FBI agents. And we're all calling for an end to the war on drugs. We want to legalize and regulate all drugs. And the reason we want to do it is because we look at this from the viewpoint of law enforcement, and we know, for instance, we did this once. We had alcohol prohibition in the United States. Only lasted 13 years because we were smart enough to realize that alcohol prohibition created organized crime. It created the highest rate of murder in the history of the United States to that point, and the highest rate of corruption of public officials and police officers to that point in the United States. And we know that the day we ended that nasty law in 1933, the next morning, Al Capone and all his smuggling buddies, they were out of business. They were off our streets. They were no longer out there killing each other to control that very lucrative market. They were no longer killing us cops, charged with fighting that useless war. And they were no longer killing our children who were caught in crossfire and drive-by shootings, all the things we experience today. So we know that if we legalize these drugs, we can completely remove the violence. And then if we regulate them, we can get a lot of other good things. For instance, we can end overdose deaths.
Once you think that these realizations would also be accessible to, well, a number of politicians or decision makers, but yet it somehow seems very hard to find any politician to stand on this platform.
Not anymore. Not anymore, it's not. You were right, it used to be, but thanks to us, we've been around 7 years now. We've made 5,500 presentations. We're strictly a speakers bureau. We have 80 speakers now. Anybody can join us, but in order to be a speaker or board member, you have to be current or former law enforcement. That's where we get our credibility. And it's because of that credibility, it's because a cop is telling you we've got to end this thing. People that actually fought the war are telling you it's a disaster. People listen to us. In those 5,500 presentations, and we don't go out speaking to a bunch of people that want to use drugs. We speak to very conservative people usually. We speak to civic and professional organizations, religious and educational organizations, speak to things like Rotaries, Kiwanis clubs, Lions clubs, chambers of commerce. These are very conservative groups, political organizations. And we find that after we've talked to them, 80% of them agree with us, 80% of them. When we walk in the door, probably not 5%, but after they hear what we have to say, 80% agree with us.
So there is a change going on.
Oh, there's tremendous change going on. And you know what you said about politicians. Politicians are now getting on board on this. We have our state legislators. Of course, we got 50 states, and each state has their state legislators. And they have a thing called the caucus of black state legislators, African American folks. About 3 years ago, that caucus came together and passed a resolution calling for an end to the war on drugs. treat drug abuse as a health problem. That's all we want. Treat it as a health problem, not a crime problem. A year later, the National Caucus of Latino state legislators passed the same resolution. And a year after that, 225 mayors from the largest cities in the United States came together at the National Mayors Conference, and they passed the same resolution unanimously: end the war on drugs, treat drug abuse as a health problem. So you see, politicians are coming around. They are understanding.
One could also maybe think that the change in government in the United States, the change in administration, the new Obama administration, maybe have a different look on these things.
Not likely. No, we'll have to force the issue. Every president since Nixon, who was a Republican, but every president since him, whether Republican or Democrat, has made the situation worse than it was when they went into office. So it's a completely nonpartisan disaster.
But what is the power that drives them to do this? I mean, why do they keep going down this road? They must know by now, what you know, that this doesn't work.
Think of the money that's behind this. There's tremendous amounts of money involved in this. Excuse me, let me have a little sip of water here. Just think about, I'm not even talking about corruption. Think about how much money is spent Think about how much money is spent by the United States in 1 year to fight the war on drugs. It is $70 billion. That's a lot of money.
70 billion?
That's right. $70 billion is spent, and almost all of that money goes into the coffers of police departments, law enforcement. That's a lot to give up. If you ask any police department, any administrator there, they'll tell you that about 20% of their entire budget can be traced directly back to the war on drugs. Now that's a lot to ask an administrator to give up, right? So
it is going to be a problem, yeah.
Well, we're going to have to force the issue, and the only way we can force the issue is we get a huge grassroots organization, a movement to do this. And we believe the proper movement is LEAP, Law Enforcement Against Prohibition. We want, in the next 2 years, to make this an organization of over 1 million people. And if we do that, then